I'm not asking for mercy.
So you assume responsibility for the blood you've shed?
Rise and fall of Alone in the Dark game franchise. Does the survival horror genre in gaming tickle your interests? Well, in that case, you have certainly come across some of the biggest names in the genre, such as Silent Hill, Dead Space, etc. We are going to explore a game that precedes almost all survival horror games. We are going to explore the game that precedes almost all survival horror games. Yes, we are talking about none other than the Alone in the Dark franchise, the game that came back before the likes of Resident Evil stirred up the markets. The first game was released way back in 1992, and since then, there have been 5 more that were followed. With such a legacy, one might think that the Alone in the Dark franchise would continue its glorious journey and go on to become one of the timeless classics in gaming history. While it is partly the case, and the game will undeniably be remembered for a very long time by the purist horror game fans, the series did show a serious dip in the graph. It has been almost 7 years since the last game was released in the franchise, and it has left many wondering why the games, which were once so popular, lost out on their charm over time. In this video, we have decided to conduct a post-mortem of sorts and also refresh your memories of this exciting horror game franchise. We will explore all the games in the series and also look at the future possibilities in terms of another addition to the legacy. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Alone in the Dark, the meteoric rise. The year was 1992, and no one had the slightest clue that a nail-biting game could be crafted from one of H.P. Lovecraft's twisted creations. Alone in the Dark was like a breath of fresh air in the world of gaming, and it offered something that the fans weren't used to. The debut game was developed and published by Infogrames, and it was released for PC, MS-DOS, and other contemporary platforms. It was the first 3D survival horror game, and many actually believe it to be the first ever survival horror game. In fact, it was revealed that Shinji Mikami was greatly inspired by this game and introduced his learning in the original Resident Evil game. The game is premised in the 1920s, and Jeremy Hartwood, a noted artist, has committed suicide under mysterious circumstances. He lived in a mansion, which was believed to be haunted by an evil power, and a private investigator named Edward Carnby finds himself involved in the case. Jeremy's niece sends the private detective to look for a piano that supposedly holds the note explaining the mysterious death of Jeremy. After entering the supposedly haunted mansion called the Louisiana Mansion, the doors slam shut behind him, and he is stuck inside the creepy building. Soon, he discovers that there is a lot more to the place than what meets the eye. There is a constant threat to his life from deadly monsters, creatures, and from various other paranormal entities. During the process, Edward must find a way to save himself. He must also keep finding documents and other clues that explained what happened to Jeremy Hartwood and the history of the haunted mansion. You play as the helpless detective uncovering the sinister secrets while desperately trying to save himself. Besides the clear Lovecraftian influence, the story also has shades of Edgar Allan Poe's works, and the storytelling is a treat for the horror fans. The beginning of an epic journey. It is not an exaggeration when people call this a revolutionary game. As we have discussed already, this was a pioneering effort in the survival horror genre, and it was an epic launch for the franchise. The storyline was impeccable, and the gameplay created a genuinely immersive atmosphere that could spook the bravest of souls. The game with 3D graphics, something that was pretty impressive back in the 90s, and the diverse elements in the gameplay never allowed a dull moment. You could do just about anything from shooting zombies and running away from ghosts to avoiding evil forces while trying to escape the house. The protagonist is not a superhero, and just a regular guy who is as scared as you are. The graphics might seem laughable today, but considering the year was 1992, things look quite remarkable back then. One of the best things about the game was that it preserved the horror throughout the gameplay, and it is safe to say that the game wasn't easy by any means. Controls weren't the easiest, and things got tougher during some of the fights. The good thing was that players could save the game at any time, and this did help in some tricky situations. The monsters were fairly creepy, and the creators did not have to resort to excessive gore or bloodshed to scare the player. While playing the game, you will get some background details, and this will help you gain some perspective on what is so wrong about the mansion. The sound effects are out of the world, and everything from a door opening to the fighting seems unbelievably real. Even the voice acting is on point, and the overall sound of the game certainly adds to the fear factor. In short, this game is easily one of the best that the series had to offer, and the veteran gamers are well versed with its brilliance.
He and his crew would become immortal. And every 100 years...
Alone in the Dark 2, 1993. After the outstanding response to the first game, Alone in the Dark came up with a sequel just a year after the first release. Infogrames continued to be the developer and publisher, and the game was released for MS-DOS, PlayStation, Sega Saturn, among other platforms. The story focuses on private investigator Edward Carnby once again, as he investigates a kidnapping case with his partner Ted. Grace Saunders has been kidnapped, and the clues they find lead them to a mansion called Hell's Kitchen. No, not the Gordon Ramsay version, although that's no less scary. This mansion is home to a notorious gangster and his fellow thugs, and in the course of events, Ted gets killed. Edward continues the investigation, determined to bring justice to his assistant and the kidnapping victim. He discovers that the gangsters are actually possessed by spirits of former pirates who used voodoo to enjoy eternal life on Earth. Survival for Edward is not easy than it was in the previous game, and he has to rescue young Grace from the clutches of these evil entities. Besides, there might be a special reason for the mobsters to kidnap Grace.
We built our mansion, and since then, we reign undisputedly.
When something ain't broke, don't fix it. This kind of sums it up for the second game, which disappointed many of the fans simply because it unnecessarily deviated from a successful formula. One of the major changes introduced in this game were the villains, who were gangsters instead of zombies, and other paranormal creatures as seen in the first game. It was indicated that many of them were possessed by evil spirits, but that wasn't enough to recreate the magic of the first game. Don't get us wrong, this game was not a bad game by any means. We just believe that it could have been a lot better if it didn't try for something new forcibly. Now, let us come to the positives, because there are plenty. For starters, the gaming area has increased considerably, and the storytelling is still up to the standards established by the first game. People who like to have a sense of adventure in the gameplay will be delighted with the outcome, but you do need to have a little patience to play this game fair and square. The gameplay will test your reflexes and your mind, with the controls being a little tricky, only to add to the challenge. There are lots of more enemies to deal with, and Edward has to be taught as they come to deal with all of these threats. The graphics seem a little patchy, but you would barely notice it, as it has such a gripping gameplay. The realism in this game certainly beats its predecessor, but the same cannot be said about Alone in the Dark 2. The sounds are adequate once again, and the enthusiastic voice acting saves the day as well. Overall, there might be several imperfections, but this game still stands out as a decent addition to the series. In case you are wondering if this was the beginning of the end, it certainly wasn't. In fact, we are still far from it. Alone in the Dark 3, 1995. Many people also know this game as Alone in the Dark, Ghosts in Town, and this third addition to the franchise was once again developed and published by Infogrames. The storyline acknowledges the action of Edward Carnby, as in the previous games, and he has now earned himself the reputation of a private investigator who specializes in supernatural cases. In the middle of nowhere, in the Mojave Desert in California, a ghost town called Slaughter Gulch is the hotbed for unexplained activities in this time around. A film crew has disappeared from this region, and Jeremy Hartwood's niece Emily from the first game is one of the missing crew members. As Edward investigates the mysterious disappearance, he realizes that the town is reeling from a curse, and an evil cowboy is in the mix of things. As the mastermind behind the missing crew members, Edward will need every bit of his strength and wit to move through the deadly town and get to the root of the matter. Warning signs of growing stagnant. It is an alarming sign for any franchise if the new additions are not making sufficient improvements and not fixing the past mistakes. Alone in the Dark 3 suffers from extending the monotony and offering nothing new that the previous games did not have. Moreover, there is no real improvement, and the fans were left a tad bit disappointed with the final outcome. The gameplay continues with the adventures of Edward Carnby, and just like the previous games, this one is also inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft. The previous two games received some criticism for messing up the balance between adventure and action, and the developers tried to fix the issue. However, a glaring problem was the polygon-based graphic engine that started to show signs of aging by now. It is a good thing that the graphics are supplemented by an authentic Western digital soundtrack and voiceovers, because the game is anything but visually appealing. Coming back to the gameplay, this time you get a good mix of puzzles and arcade play, and you will have to go through a lot of armed and unarmed fighting. The puzzles are a lot more integrated into the game than before, and some of the puzzles will require knowledge from the previous games to solve. There are various weapons to choose from, but at times the only weapon is your mind. The player must make it a point to save the game frequently, because there are some sudden and unexpected deaths that come from nowhere. The developers tried to make the game less difficult with 3 predefined difficulty levels. Clearly, there have been no shortcomings in terms of efforts, but the game started to show signs of stagnating, and it was probably the beginning of the franchise slowly losing fans. Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare, 2001. Infogrames was involved for the last time with the franchise, and they did make their stay memorable with this game. The 4th installment of the franchise was developed by Darkwoods, while Infogrames handled the publishing part. This survival horror game was released for PlayStation, Microsoft Windows, Game Boy Color, and Dreamcast. Later, a PlayStation 2 version was also released in Europe. The gameplay timeline takes quite a leap, and the narrative takes you to the current day and age, which is the year 2001. Edward Carnby's friend and partner Charles has been found dead on a strange island, and the private investigator steps in to look into the matter. He learns that Charles was searching for 3 ancient tablets, and these could potentially unlock some incredible powers. Edward Carnby is asked to recover the ancient tablets and also find the one who killed his partner. He is joined by an intelligent professor named Aileen Cedrak, and she flies along with him to investigate the case further. After an unknown creature attacks their aircraft, they both jump out in their parachutes and land on the island. However, they are separated, and Edward has to deal with the horrors that lurk in the deep forests of the island. Your task is to play either as Aileen or Carnby and solve the mysteries as they come. Adds fuel to the dying fire. The horror game enthusiasts were relieved to find that the franchise redeemed itself with a worthy addition to the series. So, what is it that changes things all of a sudden? Well, for one, the makers were clearly inspired by other contemporary works such as Resident Evil, and this brought a fresh look to the game, which was the need of the hour. The action-packed flavor in this survival horror game was a cool innovation, and the modern-day theme works fine, even without much of a correlation with the previous stories. We do not mind at all, especially because there are some good-looking backgrounds that change the look of the game altogether. It keeps up with the times, and the impressive visuals clearly make a strong impact. There are some subtle changes in the gameplay as well, and we loved the introduction of the flashlight. The game is purposefully quite dark, and the flashlight works like magic in certain situations. The evil entities hiding in the dark are intimidated by the light, and this allows you to save some ammo at times. The controls are not exactly the finest, but we aren't complaining. However, the lack of the puzzles was a serious letdown, because many of them were a bit too easy. In fact, the overall difficulty level could have been a little more challenging, because once you get the hang of things, it becomes a walk in the park. There are some fans who do not like the game because of the multiple changes it introduces, but we think otherwise, and to each his own. The sales figures show that the game was loved widely, and it breathed hope for a longer run in the franchise. There was even a movie adaptation of this game, but that fell flat on its face due to poor execution. Alone in the Dark, 2008. This game was developed by Eden Games and published by Atari for PC, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 2. The PS3 version was called Alone in the Dark Inferno, and despite the best efforts of the creators, this game ended up as a rather average entry in the series. When the game got too many negative reviews, Atari even threatened the reviewers with lawsuits, but it was all in vain. One of the main problems was the kind of change the makers introduced in the gameplay. It hardly felt like a game in the Alone in the Dark franchise, and that wasn't a big positive for the game. The story takes off with Edward Carnby, the private investigator who specializes in paranormal cases. He is reeling from the adverse effects of an exorcism performed on him by some occultists, and he is trapped in a collapsing building looking for an escape route. To make matters worse, he is slightly amnesiac and doesn't have much memory of the events that took place. He detects a demonic presence in the building and watches people get killed randomly. Eventually, he finds out that there is something far more sinister in store for humanity, and he must do something to fight these malevolent forces. The Descent into Darkness. The gaming industry is so competitive that there is no room for mediocrity. Alone in the Dark learned this the hard way with such average entries that started to turn the fans away from the legacy of the series. Is this game so terrible? It certainly isn't, but the problem is that it doesn't blow your mind either. The dark and sinister plot is engaging, but the technical shortcomings come in the way of the game exploring its true potential. The amnesiac private investigator stumbles into an apocalyptic New York City, and all kinds of evil forces have humanity by the scruff of its neck. It is him, armed with a shotgun, versus the evil legion. There is an extensive inventory and tons of stuff to choose from and use. As you go along playing this game, you will discover certain combos that are more suitable to your style and strategies. The atmosphere is quite fitting for a horror game, and both the outdoor and indoor settings offer plenty of leverage for the player. The problems start to crop up within a few minutes of starting the game, and one of the biggest bothers for us was the visual inconsistencies, largely because of the random cutscenes. The graphics are pretty average, and the technical shortcomings make the game feel rough around the edges. This takes away some brownie points from the scary nature of the game, and the monster-infested streets of New York are hardly as intimidating as they should have been. The combat mechanics are flawed, and somewhere the great ambition of the developers could not match up to their skills. The game did not really set the cash boxes jingling, and more importantly, it was probably the one that lost a lot of fans. Alone in the Dark Illumination, 2015. This is the last entry in the franchise so far, and it is easily the worst among the lot. Developed by Pure EPS this time, was published by Atari before they sold it to THQ Nordic. The story takes a detour from the usual theme of the series, and it takes you to an abandoned town near Virginia. This town was mysteriously flooded, and everyone was evacuated immediately. As of now, the town is in ruins, and there are various rumors about this forgotten town. Some believe that the strange accidental flooding was caused by certain dark forces, and presently, people do not dare to venture out into the abandoned town. There have been some unverified reports of strange creatures in the town, and locals believe that a powerful supernatural entity called the Darkness resides in the town. Our protagonists walk into this maze of mysteries, and the adventure begins, only to fail disastrously. one where it all falls apart. Well, there is no hiding from the fact that this is simply a terrible game. There are almost no redeeming qualities about it, and even the Lovecraftian touch is missing from the presentation. The worst part about the game is that it desperately tries to be a horror game and has very little to show for. The missions are utterly boring, and even you cannot resist the nostalgia of the Alone in the Dark brand. You are bound to be disheartened after a point. The graphics are below par, and the creature designs are found lacking as well. The availability of light is such a big issue in the game that you will soon be annoyed with the complications it causes. Even the appearance of the Great Cthulhu in the end isn't enough to ignite the interests of the fans. The game lacks on the technical front, and even the sound system, which used to be a great asset for the franchise, seems to be faltering. All in all, it is not only a failure in terms of Atari's legacy, but it is also the downfall of the series. After the pathetic sales figures and the bashing it received, there hasn't been another game in all these years, which brings us to our last segment. Will you see another Alone in the Dark game? Now, this is the million-dollar question that the die-hard fans of the franchise are eager to figure out. Without being unrealistically optimistic, it is tough to say that there will be another addition to the series anytime in the near future. The last game that was released in 2015 did not offer much of a competition to some of the other games that were available during the time, and the sales took a major hit. Thus, it is unlikely that the series will be brought back. Even if they decided to go ahead and create another game, it has to be a massive change from the failed ones, and simply the brand value wouldn't be enough to sell it in the markets. Personally, we would love if a game was created with a Lovecraftian touch, new age gameplay, and the shivering down the spine kind of horror that the fans once loved about the series. Currently, the rights of the game are possessed by THQ Nordic, and they do love to own some of the retro franchises and bring them back in style. But as of now, they have their hands full with plenty of projects, and they haven't announced a new game yet. The only hope for the fans is that they have revived franchises before, and they might just decide to do the same with Alone in the Dark in the distant future. Till then, let's keep our fingers crossed. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks, everyone.